So again, I'm Jason Healey, Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. This is to talk about some work that we've been doing with the Department of Defense Minerva program, which is looking at social science for military problems. What we've been looking at is what are the dynamics of cyber conflict? How are the dynamics different at the tactical and technical level from the operational and strategic level? And how are those dynamics different between the cyber domain and the other domains of warfare, and accordingly what all the Department of Defense do differently. So beginning with a 3-year study. So when we talk about dynamics, what we mean by dynamics are the kinds of things that are always said to define the domain when you open up some new strategy, when you open up some new paper or report. What are the things that report are commonly going to say that conflict in cyberspace is like, or that cyberspace is like? It's going to say, for example, that it's the speed of light. It's going to say the attacker probably has the advantage, that it's difficult to do attribution, that there's no return address on the missile, that it's borderless, that it's hard to deter. It's owned by some percentage, 70% to 95% owned by the private sector. And in political science research, it might say that this is inconsequential. In military documents, it might say it's incredibly consequential and everything resides on it. It might talk about confused authorities. It might say definitions are confusing. And this is what we mean by the dynamics. What are the things that we tell ourselves about this domain and what it's like to operate in it as we try and capture the truths of the operating in this domain? So what we're going to be trying to do over the next year is, and we've already started, in saying, some of these dynamics that we tell ourselves are absolutely the physics of the domain and we can't possibly change. For example, speed of light. What else? Peer-to-peer network. It's also a scale-free network, right? We can't possibly change those things and still have it be something that we call the internet. You can't design an internet that's not speed of light and have it be a meaningful internet. Others of these things that we tell ourselves are actually based on design choices or emergent behavior. For example, the attacker has the advantage. Well, we could change that with different technology or usage. In the early days of the internet, they might have designed it differently so that the attacker did not have the advantage. And it would still recognizably be the internet. Likewise, we could have built-in attribution. We could have built-in strong authentication into the early protocols. Right? That the internet doesn't have to be that way. We designed it that way. Others are the implications of the first order. And the one I give there, because it's easy for attackers to hide, because it's hard to do attribution, that makes deterrence difficult. Others of those are because the attacker has the advantage in general terms, that therefore we feel more that we need to do hackback. Because it's speed of light, then we feel that we might need looser rules of engagement. Others are self-imposed, by which I mean it's not happening in the network, it's happening in our brains or in our bureaucracies, like difficult definitions. Right? And there's nothing about cyberspace that inherently breaks definitions, right? Definitions are in the mind of the beholder. Same thing with authorities, right? Title 10 and Title 50, that's our problem, that's not the internet's problem. Others are conditional on adversary behavior. Right? No adversaries have yet, that we can tell from our research, used cyberspace to cause kinetic death and harm. We've gotten pretty close. Maybe we've gotten there with WannaCry and NotPetya. But so far, nation states are staying below that line. Our conversations about the dynamics of cyber conflict could look very different tomorrow if the United States, if any other main protagonist decided to cross that line. If there was a kinetic attack by North Korea on South Korea tomorrow, we're going to have a very different discussion on the dynamics of cyber conflict, which just shows how conditional they are. On a lot of what we take as truths really are, in many ways, conditional. Just like and some of those conditions are the current state of technology or dependence, right? The dynamics have changed to a significant degree as we've come to depend on these technologies more. So I'm not going to dive into these. We've already started to do a good categorization. We'll do a workshop at SEPA in 31st of October with Bob Jervis and Herb Lynn, where we'll talk about this. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. So again, we don't expect we're going to discover anything new, but hopefully we can at least bring in some more rigor in how we talk about this. When we start getting into this, is where the bulk of my talk will be, is we talk about what are the key differences with the other domains, because this is where we think we have some of the most confusions. Confusions? Can that be plural? Confusing ideas. So a key question when you're talking to a cyber leader in government or the military is, what do you think the biggest difference between cyber and another domain and your domain is, and the other domains of warfare? And you might get any of those dynamics. They might say, well, it's really speed, it's surprise, and you might hear different ones depending on that officer's or that official's background. For at least us and who we're starting the research, it looks like, to me at least, the private sector is maybe the role of that private sector is so different and might be the most defining characteristic of conflict in cyberspace. In most other kinds of conflict, the civilians are going to get out of your way. In cyber conflict, they are quite possibly the dominant aspect of national cyber power. And so what we've found in my research and others is that the private sector and the government have these comparative strengths. The private sector has some subject matter expertise, agility, and they have their hands deep in cyberspace. They can bend it if they need to. Government can't do those things, or is not at its best when it's trying to replicate those things. The government has staying power, massive resources, which is obviously tied, and access to the other levers of power. They can arrest people, they can do demarches, they can stab them in their sleep if we need to. And so we think that this is one of the most central differences. But it goes further than that, because there are implicit trade-offs that I think the military is still getting its arms around, and the White House is still getting its arms around, on the role of the private sector in this space. We're here at AUSA. If we wanted to procure, we're going to be replacing the M1 by 2040. We're looking at all these great military vehicles. We're looking at new military aviation. If the Army decides that it's going to buy 500 new helicopters, it doesn't affect Boeing. It doesn't affect Airbus. It doesn't affect United Airlines. If the Air Force is going to get more F-35s, or the Army is going to get more military aviation capability. But if Cyber Command wants to keep an extra 1,000 zero days, or NSA does, that fundamentally changes our security and this relationship in different ways than it does in the other domains. And we've got to get we're not just seeing these trade-offs, I think, in the conversation as well as recognizing them. Okay. Also, one that I think is heavily overlooked is the role of surprise, in that surprise cyber capabilities lend themselves to surprising uses in ways that I don't think that we have fully comprehended. If you see most of the issues that's affected the U.S. recently, that been, oh man, we had a failure of imagination. We didn't imagine that it would be used that way. When we said that espionage for national security purposes was okay, we didn't imagine that the Chinese would imagine that OPM was involved in that. We didn't imagine that they might think that United Health was involved in that. We didn't imagine that Sony might go after these targets. We didn't imagine that Iran might go after these targets. It lends itself to surprising uses because it's so novel. It lends itself to covert and clandestine use, which again is going to lead to surprising uses. Some nations, including especially China, have it as their actual doctrine to use it early on in a conflict when it might be surprising. Each side, I love this phrase by Amy Ziegert out at Stanford, we're on a state of, how does she put it, constant state of ambush on each other's networks, right? That's leading itself to miscalculation and, again, surprise. I was just having breakfast with a former Undersecretary of Defense who said, imagine if you've got a capability, if one side has a capability to take out the other satellites, a soft kill on one side satellites, the other side knows the other side has that capability and has the ability to take it out, right? It's lending itself to these surprise uses in this escalation. So because it's so relatively undiscovered, there's not that many ways that you can use armor in a surprising way. Even air power you can't even use in a particularly surprising way anymore. I don't think the military has thought enough about how cyber might be used in surprising ways, and I think we need to do a better job of that. to roll into deterrence, because it's a cyber pavilion, at some point you got to talk about deterrence. Where we come on that for Professor Jervis and I that are doing the research is it looks like deterrence is actually working spectacularly well in this domain. We first started talking about a cyber Pearl Harbor in 1991. So for the past 26 years, June 28th, 1991, something like that. So for the past 26 years, we've felt our neck is bared to others' capabilities, that we felt strategically vulnerable to other states' capabilities, and then felt strategically vulnerable to our capabilities. And yet in 26 years, no states have crossed that line above death and destruction. If this were any other kind of military capability, we would be trying to explain that. We would be saying, why haven't we crossed that line yet? If it was nuclear, we would say, well, it's deterrence, it's entanglement, we would be looking to find reasons. And in cyber, we don't even recognize that has happened, that nations have been showing restraint above that line. People will tell you deterrence isn't working, when in fact, I think the conversation has to start where it is working. It's working above that line. Below that line, it is absolutely not working. No states, including the United States, are showing much restraint below that line. U.S. is showing some restraint. Okay, I'll give us that. And because of that, I think that deterrence might be the wrong word for what we're talking about there. Below that line, we might want to be talking about stability below that line, so that we can keep nation-state behavior below that line of death and destruction unless we're in an actual war. Right? If we're worried about instability and miscalculation, then deterrence is the wrong concept. We might want to think about stability. We might want to think about coercion, because states are already using these capabilities against one another. So we're not deterring someone from stopping something, we're trying to coerce them to stop doing something they already are. And frankly, when I was on the Defense Science Board Task Force for Cyber Deterrence, I found that many of my colleagues, when they were talking about deterrence, meant that we want the other guy to stop what they're doing, but we want to completely be able to do whatever we want. I'm not arguing that as a national security goal, but that's not really deterrence, that's supremacy or dominance. And that works differently, and we need to be honest with ourselves if that is what we want. And remember, because deterrence works very differently if your adversary thinks they're punching back, not punching first. And a lot of our adversaries are pretty sure they're punching back. Okay, and so this leads me into a place that I think cyber conflict is far more escalatory and destabilizing than we currently think. My colleague Bob Jervis at Columbia University in 1978, he wrote a concept on the security dilemma. That is, imagine you've got several neighbors. One decides that they're going to arm themselves because you never know what your neighbors are going to do in a state of anarchy. They see that you arm yourself. They don't know what your intent is going to be now, and your intent might change, so they decide to arm themselves. You see that, and you end up in this spiral escalation. He said, and you see this among states, and he says that's doubly dangerous when it's offense dominant, and you can't tell the difference between offense and defense. Well, that kind of sounds like what we tell ourselves of the dynamics of cyber conflict. Because he says if you're in that situation, it's double dangerous, because if one side is getting something that they mean defensively, it might actually be meant to be used offensively. You can't tell the difference. And if it's offense dominant, then you might not have an opportunity to defend yourself. So everyone has to stockpile these very similar seeming weapons, and that gives a strong incentive to try and attack first. And as I was reading this from Bob, and we were saying, well, wait a minute, our field isn't just doubly dangerous, right? You can't tell the difference between attack and defense, but it's tough to tell the difference between offensive preparation of the environment, between that and espionage, right? General Hayden will always talk about how espionage attack is a lesser included form of espionage. That we're not just stockpiling the capabilities, we're actually using them against one another all of the time. And low barriers to entry. That it's not just the nation states that are stockpiling these, but it's non-states as well, and we've got these proxy relationships between states and non-states. So I think there's a lot of the escalatory and destabilizing dynamics here that we haven't fully understood yet, and we need to get our arms around. Because let's face it, every year seems to be far worse than the year before that, and we need to start coming up with some explanations on why that's so. I also think it's escalatory on our side, right? I'm a former SIGINTer. I helped set up the first Joint Cyber Command back in 1998. I had to have a lot of colleagues say after the Snowden revelations, well, this is espionage, this is just the way it happens, and people that have a problem with this just need to grow up and look at how the world works. And then I got a very different story from my colleagues after OPM. And once it was their information that was part of the espionage, all of a sudden, many of them now thought that was something that we had to respond to. I've seen the same on the revelations of the past week on the NSA contractor in Russia getting into those networks. We said a couple of years ago that was just espionage, and that's the way the game is played. And now I'm seeing a lot of escalatory talk in Congress and amongst others. So again, I come back to stability might be way more important than deterrence. Okay, that rang.